Here is what we're told about the early age of rail travel. The steam locomotive was invented in the early 1800s. The first passenger railways began operating in the 1820s and 1830s. By mid-century, rail networks were expanding across Europe and North America. And the grand train stations, the enormous cathedral-like terminals that still stand in cities today, were built to serve those growing networks. That explanation is clean. It is logical. It is the one found in virtually every textbook on the subject. But then you look at the stations themselves, and the numbers don't quite line up. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's start with something specific. The Great Hall of Union Station in Washington, D.C., opened in 1907, has a main waiting room that measures approximately 96 feet in height and covers over 75,000 square feet of floor space. At the time of its opening, the entire population of Washington, D.C. was roughly 330,000 people. The station was designed to handle 50,000 passengers per day. That number, 50,000 per day, sounds impressive until you consider that in 1907 Washington, D.C. did not yet have a subway system. It had limited streetcar infrastructure. The majority of the city's population did not commute by rail at all. Long-distance rail travel in that era was expensive, slow by modern standards, and largely restricted to business travelers, the wealthy, and mail transport. So the question that sits quietly at the back of the mind is this: why build for 50,000 daily passengers when the realistic daily ridership, given the economic and infrastructure conditions of 1907, was a fraction of that figure? That could be forward planning, optimistic architecture, civic ambition. Except it isn't just Washington, D.C. Kansas City Union Station, opened 1914. One of the largest train stations ever constructed in the United States. Its total floor area exceeds 850,000 square feet. Its main hall rises to 95 feet. At the time of its completion, Kansas City had a population of approximately 250,000 people. The station was built to process up to 60 trains per hour. In 1914, Kansas City's entire rail system did not come close to operating 60 trains per hour. The capacity built into that structure was not reactive. It was not built to meet existing demand. The demand, by the station's own operational records from its early decades, never came close to filling what had been constructed. By the 1980s, Kansas City Union Station had fallen into such severe disuse that it required a citywide tax initiative to fund its restoration. A building constructed with extraordinary precision and material investment, within living memory, had become functionally obsolete before it ever reached its intended operating capacity. This is not a story about poor planning. This is a story about scale that does not match the timeline. Now pull back further. The pattern of over-engineered rail infrastructure appearing in the 19th and early 20th centuries is not limited to a handful of American cities. It repeats, with remarkable consistency, across geography, across political systems, across wildly different economic contexts. St. Pancras Station in London, opened 1868. Its train shed, the single-span iron and glass roof constructed by William Barlow, was, at the time of its completion, the largest enclosed space on Earth. Not the largest train shed. The largest enclosed space. Of any kind. Anywhere. The British rail network at that moment was expanding rapidly, yes. But the operational capacity required by the rail line serving St. Pancras at the time of its opening was, by historical freight and passenger records, considerably below what the structure was engineered to accommodate. Engineers of the era did not build to current demand. They built, in case after case, city after city, to a scale that implied a future that, in many cases, never fully arrived in the form anticipated. That detail invites a straightforward question. What were they anticipating? There is a conventional answer, and it deserves to be stated clearly. Victorian-era architects and engineers, particularly in Britain and the United States, were operating within a culture of civic monumentalism. Grand public buildings were expressions of institutional power, national ambition, and municipal pride. Size was symbolic as much as it was functional. This explanation carries real weight. It is well documented. It is not wrong. But it does not resolve the engineering specifics. Symbolic ambition does not require a single-span iron roof engineered to structurally exceed every enclosed space on the planet. Symbolic ambition does not require ventilation systems, load-bearing frameworks, and subterranean service corridors designed to operate at sustained throughput levels decades ahead of what the surrounding city could plausibly generate. Symbol and function are different categories. The scale of these buildings speaks to function. There is another element that rarely appears in the standard architectural histories of these stations: speed of construction. St. Pancras's train shed, that record-setting enclosed span, was completed in approximately 2 years. Washington, D.C., Union Station, with its 75,000 square feet of waiting hall and its miles of underground service passages, was completed in 3 years. Kansas City Union Station, 850,000 square feet, was completed in roughly 4 years. Comparative modern construction timelines for structures of equivalent complexity and scale regularly run between 8 and 15 years, and that is with modern materials, modern logistics, modern equipment. The standard explanation involves skilled labor operating at industrial scale, with relatively unconstrained site access and simpler regulatory environments. That explanation is reasonable as far as it goes, but it sits alongside another number that is harder to dismiss. The number of workers killed during the construction of Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, according to official records from the period, unclear. The project's labor mortality records are incomplete. For a construction site of its era, operating at that scale for that duration, a modern occupational safety historian would expect to find detailed incident documentation. What exists is fragmentary. That is not an accusation. It is a gap. Gaps, when they cluster around the same type of structure in the same historical period across multiple countries, stop feeling like coincidence. They start feeling like a question that hasn't been asked loudly enough. By the time you begin looking for the pattern, you find it everywhere. That is either a sign that the pattern is real, or a sign that the human mind is exceptionally good at finding shapes in noise. Both possibilities deserve to sit on the table. But before deciding which one applies, it is worth following the evidence a little further. Because the stations we examined in Phase 1, Washington, D.C., Kansas City, London, are not outliers. They are, in fact, among the more modest examples of what was being constructed during the same concentrated window of time. Consider Philadelphia's 30th Street Station, completed in 1933. Neoclassical exterior. Interior main hall rising 95 feet, lined with columns and coffered ceilings. At the time of its completion, Philadelphia was a major industrial city, one of the largest in the United States. Rail travel was at or near its peak as a mode of long-distance transport in America. And yet, the station was built to handle passenger volumes that, even at the height of American rail's golden era, it rarely sustained for more than brief wartime peaks. By the 1960s, barely 30 years after opening, passenger volumes had declined to the point where large sections of the building were functionally unused. The station's operating costs became a persistent institutional problem. A building completed in 1933 was, by 1970, already carrying the maintenance burden of a structure built for a scale of use that had passed 37 years. That is not a story about changing times. Every era experiences changing times. This is a story about a construction investment, massive, technically precise, materially expensive, that exceeded its own era's demand almost from the moment it opened. Now move the lens to the United Kingdom. Birmingham New Street Station, original construction completed 1854. Huddersfield Station, opened 1850, described by architectural historians as one of the finest neoclassical buildings in Britain, its facade stretching 416 feet across a town that, at the time, held fewer than 30,000 people. 416 feet of neoclassical stonework. For a town of 30,000. The standard interpretation, civic pride, railway company competition, architectural fashion of the era, is documented and acknowledged. Railway companies in Victorian Britain did compete aggressively, and station architecture was part of that competition. But competition does not fully explain Huddersfield's proportions. Companies compete to attract customers who exist. In 1850, the volume of rail passengers who would pass through a town of 30,000 in the West Riding of Yorkshire did not justify a facade of that scale by any rational cost-benefit analysis available to us now, or available to the railway companies then. Something else was being expressed. Or something else was being anticipated. The United States provides a particularly concentrated version of this pattern because American rail expansion happened faster and with less regulatory friction than almost anywhere else in the world. And the American examples add a dimension the British ones don't always surface as clearly. Infrastructure before population. Denver Union Station. Original structure 1881. Rebuilt and expanded 1914. Denver in 1914 had a population of approximately 213,000 people. The rebuilt station was designed with passenger handling systems, waiting areas, and operational infrastructure scaled for a city considerably larger than Denver was, or as it turned out, would be for several more decades. Los Angeles Union Station. Opened 1939. Often called the last of the great railway stations built in the United States. Its passenger capacity, its footprint, its architectural investment, all calibrated to a vision of Los Angeles as a rail hub of continental significance. Los Angeles, of course, became one of the most car-dependent cities in the history of human settlement. The station that was built for the rail future of Los Angeles still stands, largely intact, as an architectural monument to a volume of rail use that never materialized in the form its builders anticipated. There is a concept in infrastructure planning called induced demand, the principle that building capacity for a use will, over time, generate the users to fill it. Roads are the most commonly cited example. Build a wider highway and traffic expands to fill it. Some historians apply this logic to the grand railway stations. Build it large enough, the argument goes, and the passengers will come. But induced demand requires a mechanism. It requires the conditions, economic, demographic, technological, to actually generate the users that the infrastructure was designed to absorb. In case after case across the United States and United Kingdom, those conditions either arrived too late, arrived in insufficient volume, or never arrived at all. The infrastructure sat, structurally sound, technically functional, operationally underused, waiting for a demand curve that the historical record suggests was never coming. That is not a failure of planning in the ordinary sense. Ordinary planning failures produce buildings that are too small, too fragile, too cheaply constructed. The planning failure implied here runs entirely in the opposite direction. These buildings are too large, too permanent, too precisely engineered for operational loads they were never asked to carry. And then there is the question of materials. The stonework in many of these stations, particularly the facing stone, the load-bearing columns, the flooring materials, was sourced, transported, and installed at costs that, adjusted for the economic conditions of the period, represented extraordinary capital commitments by any measure. St. Pancras's brickwork alone used approximately 60 million bricks. Washington, D.C.'s Union Station used granite quarried and transported from Maine and Massachusetts. Kansas City's Union Station used Bedford limestone in quantities that required years of pre-construction sourcing. The financial models that justified these material investments assumed operating revenues commensurate with the scale of construction. In the majority of cases, those revenues either took far longer to materialize than projected, or never fully did. This is the part of the story that infrastructure historians tend to frame as the natural optimism of the industrial era, visionary builders overreaching as visionaries sometimes do. That framing is not unreasonable, but it does not explain why the overreach is so consistent, so geographically distributed, so concentrated within a specific window of approximately 60 to 80 years, and so uniform in its structural language, the same proportions, the same ceiling heights, the same relationship between public hall and operational infrastructure, across cities that had no particular reason to be building from the same template. Some researchers who have examined this clustering of anomalies have begun to group them under a broader interpretive label. That label and what it implies, or more precisely what its proponents claim it implies, and what its critics say it actually reveals, is where this examination turns next. At some point in any serious examination of clustered historical anomalies, a name surfaces. It does not arrive through academic journals. It does not come from institutional archaeology or peer-reviewed architectural history. It emerges instead from a loose and decentralized community of researchers, amateur historians, and pattern trackers who began, particularly in the last decade, to collect these observations into a single interpretive framework. The label they use is Tartaria. It is worth being precise about what that word means, and equally what it does not mean before going any further. Because the word carries significant baggage depending on where you encounter it, and that baggage has a tendency to collapse a genuinely interesting set of historical questions into either uncritical belief or reflexive dismissal. Neither response is particularly useful. Tartaria, in the strict historical record, refers to a geographic designation used on European maps from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. On those maps, produced by cartographers in England, France, Germany, and elsewhere, the term Tartaria or Grand Tartary was applied to a vast and loosely defined territory spanning much of Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of what is now Russia and China. This is not a fringe claim. Open any serious atlas of historical European cartography, and the designation appears repeatedly, across centuries, across national traditions of mapmaking, in documents held by institutions including the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Library of Congress. The maps exist. The label exists. This is the documented starting point. What researchers in the contemporary Tartaria interpretive community do with that starting point is where interpretations begin to diverge sharply. One interpretation, the more dramatic and widely circulated version, proposes that Tartaria was not merely a geographic label but a reference to an advanced civilization of significant scale and technological sophistication, one that left physical traces in the form of monumental architecture, and one whose existence was subsequently minimized or deprioritized in the historical record. This version of the interpretation is the one most frequently encountered in online discussions, and it is the one most frequently criticized by historians. The criticism centers on a straightforward evidentiary problem. The claim that a sophisticated civilization of this kind existed requires positive evidence of that civilization. Artifacts, written records, material culture, that goes beyond the architectural observations themselves. The grand train stations of the 19th century were built during a period with extensive documentation. Engineering drawings, contracts, labor records, newspaper accounts, parliamentary debates, corporate financial filings. The paper trail exists and it points toward the builders we already know. That criticism is substantive. It deserves to be stated clearly and not dismissed. But a second interpretation, quieter, less cinematically satisfying, and in some respects more difficult to resolve, does not require any hidden civilization at all. This interpretation begins from the same set of observations examined in Phase 1 and Phase 2. The scale mismatches, the speed of construction, the operational overcapacity, the geographic consistency of architectural language across unconnected cities. And it asks a different question. Not who built these structures before history records them, but rather, what does the consistency of this pattern tell us about the period in which these structures were actually built? Some researchers in this interpretive stream suggest that the architectural uniformity, the repeated ceiling heights, the repeated proportions, the repeated material choices across cities with no obvious shared planning authority, implies the existence of a coordinating framework that the standard histories of 19th century architecture do not fully account for. Not a secret civilization. Not an erased empire. Simply a set of technical standards, institutional relationships, or shared design philosophies that moved across national borders more fluidly than the fragmented, city-by-city historical record suggests. That is a considerably more modest claim. And it is one that serious architectural historians have not fully resolved. There is a third interpretation, favored by many mainstream historians, that sits closest to the documented record. It holds that the scale anomalies are real but explicable. That Victorian and Edwardian builders operated within a culture of deliberate excess. That the overcapacity was not an accident of miscalculation but an intentional expression of institutional confidence. That the uniform architectural language spread through professional networks, pattern books, shared engineering education, and the movement of architects and engineers between projects and between countries. That the financial losses were understood at the time as acceptable costs of nation building. And that what looks, from the present, like a mysterious uniformity was, from within the period, simply the result of a coherent professional culture operating at industrial scale. This explanation is well supported. It is not without gaps, but its gaps are smaller than the gaps in the more dramatic alternatives. And yet, the question that none of these three interpretations fully closes is the one about operational timing. Not the architecture. Not the symbolism. Not the financing. The timing. Why does the window of construction for these extraordinary structures compress so tightly? Why does the period from roughly 1850 to 1930 produce, in such concentrated form, buildings whose scale implies a use future that, in the majority of documented cases, either arrived too late or too small? If the explanation is civic ambition, that ambition was geographically synchronized in a way that civic ambition, which is by nature local and competitive, does not usually synchronize. If the explanation is professional culture, that culture was operating with a consistency across national boundaries that the documented history of architectural exchange in the 19th century partially but not completely explains. If the explanation is something the Tartaria interpretive label is reaching toward, some broader organizing principle, some coordinating layer that the standard histories render invisible not through suppression but simply through the granularity of their focus, then the evidence for that principle would need to be found somewhere other than the architecture itself. And so far in the primary records, it has not been. What remains, when you set aside both the overclaiming of the more dramatic interpretations and the too easy reassurance of the conventional ones, is a set of observations that have not been fully integrated into a single coherent account. Grand structures, compressed timelines, operational overcapacity, geographic uniformity, a label drawn from old maps. A community of researchers asking questions that the Academy has not always engaged with directly. None of that resolves into a conclusion. Some questions, when examined closely enough, do not resolve. They simply become more precisely unanswered.